Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. I was coaching all day, the end of our season, for both of my boys. I coached both of their teams this weekend, so still kind of in my coach gear and a little late in the day to be getting to my reaction video, but this is the first chance I've had. We will be back with part 2 of my reboot of my reaction to Oversimplified's American Civil War, but that's a long video, and I wanted to get some content out to you today. So we're going to take a look at the Armchair Historian's video on why were casualties so high in the American Civil War. I haven't seen this video yet, but I want to keep with the Civil War theme since we're on that this weekend. And I like the Armchair Historian. He's a young guy that really knows what he's talking about and does a good job presenting things. So let's go ahead and dive right into this.
Courses Plus for sponsoring this episode. More on them later. And a big thank you to Emperor Tiger Star on YouTube. He animates maps of wars all throughout history. If you haven't already, be sure to check his channel out. He'll be joining us to read out some primary sources from the war, with an impressive southern accent, I might add. I'll be doing the same for his video, so be sure to check out my southern accent as well. If someone were to ask you, what is the costliest war in American history, how would you answer? Many would impulsively respond with the Second World War, or even Vietnam. However, this is simply untrue. The American Civil War was, and still is, the costliest conflict in American history.
Now, a big part of the reason why is because it's the only conflict where both sides count as Americans. If you only count the Union casualties, then World War II is slightly deadlier than the American Civil War.
In fact, up until about 50 years ago, the casualties of the Civil War were higher than any other American wars combined. But why was this the case? There were few automatic weapons, no tanks, or high explosives. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and today we're going to be examining what exactly made the American Civil War so lethal. First, it must be understood that far more men died of sickness than combat. Approximately 67% of all Civil War casualties were the result of infectious diseases, such as measles, dysentery, and smallpox.
And that was true for every war up to... It started to change in World War I, but World War I there were still significant portions of the population, in part because of the Spanish flu pandemic. But World War II was the first American war where the vast majority of the deaths took place because of combat wounds.
This was the natural result of assembling so many men from different areas in one location, and was exacerbated by the lack of sanitation and fresh water. The loss of men to disease had significant implications on the battlefield. For example, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, 5,000 Confederate soldiers were rendered unfit for duty due to smallpox contamination. That said, disease will inevitably cause casualties in any war. However, combat in the American Civil War was still exceptionally deadly, and this was for a variety of reasons. The first reason why combat was so deadly was the extensive use of what is perhaps the most infamous munitions of the war, the Monae Ball, which was named after its inventor, the French army officer Claude-Etienne Monae.
And it's interesting, of course, when you think of the Monae Ball, or a lot of people just say mini ball without the accent on the E. It's not a ball. It's a projectile, like you see it there. And this is the most common one, especially on the Union side. The Confederate side often had smoothbore muskets, and so they had the round, like 69 caliber ammunition. Mini balls were mostly on the Union. Confederates had some, and those are the ones you see a lot of times. I have a few of them myself somewhere that they've dug up on battlefields and things like that. And yeah, because they had those grooves on them and they fit real tightly down into a rifled musket, and they would spin when they fired because of the rifle. Incredibly accurate. It completely changed warfare. And I'm sure, as he's going to get into, the bottom line with the Civil War was that the reason the casualties on the battlefield were so high, one of them was that these mini balls were accurate, but they were also soft lead. Like, you can take one of those and squeeze it. If you squeeze hard enough, you can flatten it with your hand. And so when it would hit you, it would just kind of, like when a bullet hits, it usually tumbles. It doesn't just stay straight and go clean through. And it was soft, and so it would flatten, and it would just shatter bones. That's why they had to amputate so often. That and infection, it would shatter the entire region that it hits. So the accuracy is one, the soft lead's another. So what you have is technology getting ahead of tactics. And by the end of the war, tactics start to catch up, which is why you start to get siege warfare. You start to get images of what will happen in World War I.
Before its invention, rifles, which were loaded with musket balls, were very slow to reload, as their ammunition had to fit tightly into the barrel to accommodate the rifling. Monae solved this problem by designing a hollow, conical bullet which fit loosely in the barrel. When the rifle was fired, the hollow cavity in the projectile expanded, allowing the round to fit firmly against the rifling, giving it a spin, which drastically increased accuracy and reload speed. However, the round itself was slow and heavy, and could cause immense damage to the body. Bones that were hit generally shattered, necessitating the amputation of limbs in many cases.
Yep.
But rifled muskets weren't the only thing that increased battlefield casualties. The most formidable weapon in the arsenals of both sides was, of course, field artillery, which was invaluable on the 19th century battlefield. Improvements in weapon technology resulted in artillery being both deadlier and more accurate than ever before. Explosive shells were able to destroy entire platoons if a direct hit occurred, and
and this is important to note. Up until this time, a lot of artillery was solid shot, which solid shot could be, could wreak havoc on a battlefield. It could go through a couple of lines, but you were only going to kill maybe 4 or 5 men at most. You get these explosive shells that can explode overhead, or, when they hit the ground. A lot of them exploded overhead and shot shrapnel down on you. And then, of course, once you get close, you've got things like the 12-pound Napoleon firing canister shots, and now you're talking taking out 50 or 60 people with a shot.
The introduction of rifled artillery, such as the Parrott gun, made such hits much more likely. According to eyewitness Sergeant Jonathan Stowe, 15th Massachusetts Infantry,
"What sights I've seen that I now see around me. Shells fly past me every few seconds, carrying away branches from trees and scattering limbs around. I'm in severe pain. Furious how the shells fly. I do sincerely hope that I shall not be wounded again."
By far, the factor most responsible for producing casualties in combat, however, was the employment of linear tactics. As can be guessed, such accurate and deadly weapons were devastating to the static formations that were employed on the Civil War battlefield.
And these tactics made sense with muskets that were inaccurate, because what you do is the theory was you mass your fire. So if you put everybody shoulder to shoulder in a line and you aim down nice and low, you're bound to hit something. But now with the introduction of rifles and mini balls and much more accurate, instead of being accurate 50, 75, 100 yards, now you're accurate at 200 or 300 yards, sometimes longer depending on the weapon. And you just wreak havoc. That's why you have so many units suffering 50, 60, 70% casualties in a given battle.
Most of the commanders of the war had been trained at the United States Military Academy at West Point. In fact, at least one army at every major battle that was fought during the war was commanded by a West Point graduate, including such commanders as Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. As the doctrine taught at West Point emphasized Napoleonic-era direct approach tactics, it's no surprise that both sides deployed their forces in lines, and it is equally unsurprising that both sides suffered heavy casualties as a result. It did not help that many of the generals appointed during the war had no prior military experience and were promoted due to their political positions. However, it must be understood that there was no better way to fight in open ground at the time. In battles where cover could be used, commanders usually deployed their men behind it. For example, at the Battle of Antietam, 500 Confederates hidden behind trees and walls were able to delay the advance of several Union brigades attempting to cross what would later be named Burnside's Bridge.
Now, this is a little misleading the way he's showing it there, because they weren't just hiding behind trees and rocks and things like that. They were way up here. And if you see my visit to the Antietam battlefield, you'll see that. Cobb's Georgians that were up there. There were only a couple of hundred of them, held off a whole division. It was an incredibly difficult position to attack. They were, I don't know, maybe 60, 70, 80 feet up. A flat drop right to the edge of the bridge, and the bridge isn't that wide. Like, you could barely fit a car across it. It's maybe 10, 15 feet wide. You're only getting maybe 6, 7 men across at a time in one line. So it was the perfect defensive bottleneck.
The quintessential example of the lethality of Civil War combat is the infamous advance at the Battle of Gettysburg ordered by Robert E. Lee, known as Pickett's Charge. During the assault, 12,500 Confederate infantrymen advanced 1 mile across an open field under very heavy Union rifle and artillery fire. Although some Confederates reached Union lines, the assault was ultimately repulsed, with the Confederates taking over 6,000 casualties. The range and accuracy of rifled muskets ensured that Lee's men would begin suffering heavily well before they reached Northern lines, and even before it began, the Confederates were being subjected to extensive Union bombardment. Artillery played such a considerable role in the Civil War that, according to Craig Simmons in his book The Battle of Gettysburg, the artillery barrages at Gettysburg may well have been the loudest man-made sound on the North American continent until the detonation of the first atomic bomb.
That's quite possible. They said that it could be heard in Harrisburg, I think 35 miles away. And yeah, I mean, if you've ever been around a Civil War artillery piece being fired, first of all, they don't use the amount of powder they would have in real life. They use a fraction for those demonstrations. They use a fraction of the real powder, and it is deafeningly loud. You can't really understand it by watching a video of it. You've got to see one and hear it in person. My daughter and I last saw one at Manassas, and it was so loud, and we were quite a distance away from it. So imagine hundreds of those going off at once at a place like Gettysburg. I don't know how you could think straight after an hour or so of that. And yeah, so Pickett's Charge, first you're coming under the long-range rifled artillery fire. Then you're getting into small arms fire 300-400 yards out. Then you're in canister range, and then you're up close and dealing with bayonets and those sorts of things. It's just, there was no way that was going to succeed against defensive fire like that. And the opposite was true with the Confederates defending at Marye's Heights at Fredericksburg. And in fact, the Union soldiers, after they repelled Pickett's Charge, started chanting, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg," because it was the exact same situation, only they were on the other end of it.
And in the words of Colonel Joseph Mayo of the 3rd Virginia Infantry who fought at Gettysburg,
"The first shot or two flew harmlessly over our heads, but soon they began to get the range, and then came pandemonium. First there was an explosion on the top of a tree, and in a second there was another, followed by a piercing shriek. 2 men were killed outright and 3 frightfully wounded. Company F had suffered terribly, and a lieutenant had his leg shattered below the knee."
Towards the end of the war, the deadliness of combat on open fields was finally recognized by commanders of both sides. Accordingly, both the North and South began to employ static defensive positions and breastworks, as can be seen at the Siege of Petersburg, which was also one of the first times that the Gatling gun was employed in battle, but in a very limited capacity.
Yeah, there were Gatling guns, very, very limited, like he said, wasn't used a whole lot, didn't really have any great impact on the battlefield. You see these kinds of trench warfare things happening at Vicksburg. You see it at Cold Harbor as well. So entrenchments were starting to be used extensively by the mid to late point of the war.
When the First World War arrived 50 years later, the American Civil War was finally seen as both foreshadowing trench warfare and representing the transition from close order formations in open ground to open order formations in cover. This lesson, however, came at the cost of 620,000 American lives. 8% of American males lost their lives in the American Civil War, and 1 in 4 soldiers would never return home.
And that 620,000 is an older estimate. More recently, historians and people who have been re-evaluating the casualties in the Civil War are now projecting it somewhere at around 750,000 dead during the American Civil War. And yeah, that's a big chunk of the population at the time. The American population was a tiny fraction of what it is today. So there were very few families that were not impacted in a great way, and some families had multiple losses. I have a great-great-great-grandfather who was one of 4 brothers who fought in the Civil War, and he was the only one who came home. So that was a pretty common story in a lot of families.
If you want to learn more about the American Civil War, namely why it was fought and how it was fought, I highly recommend you watch Professor Gary Gallagher's lecture on the entire American Civil War on the site of today's sponsor, The Great Courses Plus. The Great Courses Plus is a subscription on-demand learning service with some of the best lectures and courses from Ivy League professors. By subscribing, you will gain access to a massive library with over 10,000 video lectures about any major academic subject like history, science, math, literature, music, philosophy, and more. In addition to Gallagher's lecture on the American Civil War, one of the courses I just got done fully completing is Robert Wiener's The Long 19th Century. If you really want to understand the politics and atmosphere of the Victorian era, this course has got a lot to offer with 36 episodes. One of my most popular videos was actually made possible because of one of Wiener's lectures dedicated to the Crimean War. We invite you to start your free trial at The Great Courses Plus today by using my link, thegreatcoursesplus.com/thearmchairhistorian,
Check
or
it
by
out.
clicking the link in the description below. Lastly, don't forget to check out Emperor Tigerstar on YouTube for collaborating with me on this video.
All right, so that was interesting. You know, it's not a real in-depth look at the casualties and stuff, just kind of an overview. But sometimes it's good to get those little snippets on an individual topic like that, just to address it. Let me know your thoughts. Is there something you would add to this conversation about why casualties were what they were in the American Civil War? You know, this is one of the last wars where you have huge armies fighting with kind of large unit tactics. By the time you get into the 20th century wars, the nature of warfare not only changes to much more like trench warfare and things like that, but you're also dealing with small unit tactics and dealing with kind of establishing bases of fire and, you know, and moving small units here and there, and, you know, things at the squad level and the platoon level that didn't happen much in the American Civil War. So the whole nature of warfare changes, and then of course you have combined arms because you're dealing with tanks and infantry and cavalry, and then also I just got bit by something. That was not fun. And then, of course, airplanes as well. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. I'm going to go treat whatever the heck just bit me on the neck. Hit that like button if you would. Check out the original content. I have a link in the description, and we will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.